forest. Tread lightly. Crawley's Gate by Fitzroy Lagan. The ocean wind clutches at my upturned collar as I write this from the deck of the ferry, bearing up at the rising silhouette of the approaching island for the frosted glass of the gray morning. The little outcropping looks to all the world like it's considering succumbing to the rolling waves. From what I have seen of life from Ireland's storm-battered Atlantic coastline, I can't say I blame it for entertaining the thought. I doubt anyone on the mainland would notice the absence of the small clutch of houses which huddle by the shore. I admit this travel diary is an exercise in purple prose, but I console my ego with the fact that it's also suitable for some important facts. Evidently, my hatred of texting on a tiny phone screen persists. Inishmurray, or Crawley's Gate as it's been nicknamed by the locals, is incorrectly listed on the government census data as uninhabited. Yet, here I am, being tossed about the waves for the sake of scribbling up a puffed-up promotional piece for the tourism board's new Wild Atlantic Way. Wild indeed. Rose-tinted portraits of forlorn-looking fishermen and motherly housewives mixed in with some leprechaun depictions to these shit-covered rocks to awe the American tourists. What little of the island's history I actually dug up is from the sensationalism of 17th century British accounts, pulled up from the Dublin Library. Apparently their travel columns filled the penny dreadfuls of sneering Londoners once upon a time, their rising empire giving them a hunger for the exotic and the alien. Supposedly, the native islanders of this place had sought God through solitude, abandoning the mainland and resetting as a monastic community amidst the ruins of a pre-existing megalithic society, converting calloused pagan temples to Christian worship. Time and Shiism in the islanders' ranks had excommunicated all but one of their religious leaders, whose rule saw the altering and mingling of the Christian faith, with certain rites gleamed from the howling midnight sermons with the storm-ravaged winds. When the hermit community was rediscovered by British sailors a century later, they were viewed as wholly evil and sick, wielding all the iconography from the Christian precursors in service of gods no longer Christian. Anderson, a cartographer attached to the exposition, writes of Father Molish, the craven wooden idol the locals groveled and worshipped to, and an altar with a ring of stones on the cliffside, which they beseeched to punish and drive off trespassers. Anderson attributes the later death of his wife and most of the sailors on his expedition to a vengeful curse. Practically nothing remains of that first community. The Vikings came upon it in 807 AD and burned it down with all of its residents in their wrath. The British razed it to the ground again in horror and disgust of their discovery, shattering the altar and casting the idol into the sea. And yet the altar remains, still embedded with its partial Latin phrase, Hae dormit. What little that remained was claimed by the strange storm on December 21st, 1926, which drove waves hundreds of feet over the island to drown the settlement and all of its people, snatching them away over the western cliffs, to be dashed and sucked down into the swirling currents, from where they could not rebuild. The modern inhabitants are descendants from the distant mainland cousins of that doomed community, and have only begun to return to their ancestral land as late as the 1980s, always returning to the mainland come winter. Nothing remains of that original settlement, or its whispered practices, other than the fragment of the altar, and the strange idol of Father Molish, which resurfaced a few years later, and now sits mislabeled in a Dublin museum. My principal contact at Crawley's Gate was the local priest, a Father Daniel O'Toole, who had suddenly uprooted and retired to this place from his Dublin parish, settling to serve the disenfranchised locals in the company of his adopted son, Simon. Arrival. What I had hoped to be a cursory interview has completely evaporated. Instead of a priest, I was welcomed by a funeral procession. Both Father Daniel and his son are apparently dead, one having followed the other in an act of suicide. Questioning the locals only netted me some sideways stares, and I was referred to the village pub until they had completed their grieving. Stewing over my bad luck, I resolved myself to meet with Father Daniel's next of kin, to offer my sympathies and hopefully glean some information from all this mess. Evening. It appears that the isolation of this place is more than just geographical. There is no reception out here, and the owner of the pub where I was to spend my night cheerfully informed me that the place doesn't have electricity, so that the guests, and I quote, can truly get away from it all. Get away from sanity, maybe. In the morning, I will give Father Daniel's brother a call, so I can salvage what I can from this incident, and be back in civilization by dinner. It has begun to rain outside. 30th of October. It was early morning and I hadn't slept. The bed I had rented was in the loft above the village pub, an airy attic filled with rows of beds, of which I was the only occupant. I had spent the evening in the bar below, needling the owner with questions on how they can run a business on an island whose population barely covers the double digits. It would appear that, despite all appearances, this forlorn place does enjoy a singular brand of tourism. Every day, the ferry splutters back and forth from the mainland, depositing handfuls of silent arrivals without luggage, who file out across the island's shoreline, over the honeycombed caves and chalk-covered cliffs. They rarely talk to the locals or purchase return passage on the ferry, merely emptying their pockets at the pub until the onset of evening. Forming grim processions, they trek out of the village into the silent night and vanish among the western cliffs. Their bodies occasionally reappear upon the coastline, but far more often, they are never returned by the ravening currents that rage beneath the island's subterranean labyrinths of limestone caves. The Irish government has scrambled to repress the publication of this fact, either in fear of adding sensationalism, or, as I suspect, damage their campaign to touristize the harsh barrenness of this place. Only the locals seem willing to talk, their eyes losing all their initial warmness and hospitality, as they recount their individual stories of this or that stranger from all corners of the world who disappeared after a brief conversation. One man I spoke to recalled a November night where he, along with other locals, returned to the mainland, as was their yearly ritual. He spoke of the twinkling lights of rowboats that he glimpsed from his cottage window, inextricably creeping out into the abysmal waters towards the island's shadow. Rows of empty boats were found come spring, littering the shoreline and choking the harbor entrance. The cocktail mix of these haunting revelations mingled in my mind, and ensured I didn't sleep. I felt the mattress shift beneath me, and contemplated the previous souls who likely occupied it. Did they feel relief at the end, or merely hopeless resignation? I could feel them in every rhythmic shift of the waves outside my window, which seemed to drag every sound and smell from the teeming shoreline up from the harbor to be deposited into my bedroom. When I woke up from whatever sleep I eventually managed, the sun was cresting the horizon through the window, anemic and pallid like an inflamed eye. I scratched at the ring of calcified gunk that had sealed the corners of my lips and eyes, and slipped from the bed with all the weight of a troubled night. Suddenly, a hunched figure slid from underneath my bed to meet my feet, brushing it with a coat of knotted fur. I jumped against the hanging roof beams, hurling books and notebooks against the thing and sending it scurrying to the corner of the room. It was a dog, hunched low with age and aches, having sat unnoticed under my bed throughout the night. Its head rose to sniff at me. That revealed a skull that had been shaped expecting eyes, but lacked everything except a probing snout, extending over a mangle of sparse fur, stretched over puckered skin. The flat, wrinkled skin, where the eyes should have been, shifted and moved as if staring, finally signaling me with a downward tip of its tail, which hung limp in unwelcoming hostility. It silently paced by me and out the door without acknowledgement. I resolved not to go back to sleep. Later, I waited for 2 hours on the frigid harbor pier at low tide, before the ferry crept timidly into view from the distant mainland. Standing there with an upturned collar, racked with tiredness and a racking cough, I passed the time puzzling over the skeletal remains of fish and pale sea creatures that collected on the stony shore beneath my feet. They lay there, undisturbed, looking up at me, with hollow eyes and sand-filled mouths. Why hadn't any seabirds come to pick them over? The vision of the cliff jumpers came back to me, and I impulsively scanned the slime for any other bones that may have submerged there. I shivered and then stuck my hands in my pockets. When the ferry finally pulled into the harbor, a single squat man in a gray parka stepped to the shore. The lack of any other passengers comforted me. The man did not shake my outstretched hand, but merely told me his name was Patrick, and that he was Father Daniel's brother. I would quickly learn that Patrick was a quintessential piece of shit, leering at me like an eternal enemy from a furrowed little face, taut formed from a lifetime of scowling, mounted on a wide body of skinny legs. He looked like a caricature of some mobster goon. Giving him my name was pointless, as he had already settled on calling me Big Man, and he did not ask for my credentials, merely assuming I was some official involved with his brother's funeral. He spoke with a gruff accent that refused to distinguish between sarcasm, joke, or insult. I would soon learn to assume that everything Pat said was an insult. He talked the whole way up the craggy path that hugged the shoreline, leading up to Father Daniel's now dilapidated house. Pat seemed to hold me indirectly responsible for the whole affair, which had dragged him out on his weekend to this godforsaken rock, which valued non-rustic electricity when the football match was on. At intervals, I peppered him for information on his brother and son-in-law, something from which to salvage a story to replace my torpedoed tourism piece. What I had learned was that Father Daniel's choice to relocate to the island was only partially motivated by altruism and service to his parishioners. Evidently, he had heard of the morbid phenomenon on the island, and he had trekked out here to form some sort of beacon for those who stalked the cliffs. He would spend his evenings strolling the winding paths late into the night, armed with a warm cup of tea and a kind word to coax them back from the precipice. Most of them jumped regardless, but some of them were persuaded at the last moment to turn to the welcoming glow of his kitchen window and his bright-eyed son, a lighthouse casting dual beams out into the void. But of course, that was all over now, snuffed out and snatched away by the sea winds, leaving only the shell of an empty house for scavengers like Pat to pick over, like an engorged seagull. He had resumed his onslaught of complaining and accusations at my inquiries, punctuating each remark with a finger stuck in my face, which oozed a fingernail cocktail of tobacco, shit, and orange peels. I gagged and made use of my big man legs to outpace the squat freak, crushing stones and fish bones as I rhythmically strode up the street. There really were a lot of fish now. Every rock and pebble was bed-decked with crenulated slivers of silver bone, and flagged with waving strips of translucent scales, which flapped in the breeze. Looking around for birds of any kind, I saw only fossilized nests of marble eggs, which dotted the white chalk cliffs. After a day and night of being drip-fed the horrible history of this place, my sleep-deprived mind played tricks on me with the pencil-smudged topography, and I thought I saw here and there inscriptions scratched into the chalk like long goodbyes. We arrived at the house crouched low and invalid from the crushing wind and the oncoming storm clouds. The place was a stocky, standard cottage, crouched right up against the cliff edge, as if daring itself to look over. I tried to roll a cigarette whilst Pat tried to get the key to the front door from his puffed-up parka coat. Rain clouds glutted the horizon, and I thought it looked like they were psyching themselves up for their chance to finally erode this onerous place and drive it back underwater. Absent-mindedly, the cigarette had burned itself to the filter and singed my fingers. I cursed and flicked it over the yawning precipice. Pat clicked the door open and we stepped inside. The scene that greeted us was one of complete schizophrenia. Layers of handwritten pages covered the floors and walls, inscripted with what looked like title maps and pages of the Bible. Here was an 18th century admiralty chart. There, pages from the Book of Revelations, scoured with notes and torn apart in frustration. The whole interior was damp, and clumps of waterlogged pulp shook themselves free from the dangling stalactites and plopped to our feet. We stood in silence. Whilst Pat collected himself, I began pacing from the nearest wall, tracing the fluttering papers, for a starting point from which I might be able to unravel some sort of message or meaning. It was only when I began to study the third wall that I noticed that there was no furniture in the house. Every inch of space had been dedicated to the rampant expansion of the handwritten notes. Pat, who had recovered himself, trudged upstairs in search of valuables, shouted that everything had been dragged up there and piled up like barricades, and he balked about having to crouch down in order to get to the bedrooms. I took the opportunity to pocket a stack of what looked like diary entries, neatly piled on a space of untouched floor apart from the rest of the room. Skimming through them, snippets of words and passages leaped off the page and pricked my guts, chilling me deeper than anything managed by the rising winds outside. The accepted story of what had happened was that the son Simon had stumbled off the edge of the cliff on his way to school, and Father Daniel, broken in grief, had followed shortly after. But the scrawled entries from the former priest told a different story. They were full of tangled thoughts and furtive descriptions of shimmering things seen through binoculars at low surf, of oily tracks on the beach, of the image of a child's brightly colored school bag disappearing over the cliffs, hand in hand with a shadowy figure, of strange piping sounds that mingled with the sea wind, and at night, things that came down to perch on the rooftop that were not birds, but instead fed on birds. I peeled handfuls of sodden sheets from the walls and filled my pockets. Pat materialized behind me to protest the theft of his property. I shot him a glare that dared him to make something of it, and he slunk back upstairs to rifle through drawers. I left the house, still grasping the damp pages in my pockets. Walking back alone, I reached the village just before the storm I had seen gathering from the cliffs. The windows of the pub were slathered in condensation, and I perched on the bar stool by the fireside with a beer, and I began processing the dark shadow of which the day's events had put over my psyche. By midnight, I had the majority of the snatched notes compiled and fermenting in my brain, alongside a few pints. Propped up on one elbow as I transcribed my notes, to stop from swaying on my stool, the pen having to circumvent the dark circles left on the paper by rings of drinks that I didn't remember drinking. It was in this state that Pat materialized from some shadowy nook. He stuck one of those awful fingers into my back, barking that I talk to him in private about the day's events and something important he had discovered. I let the half-heard order hang in the air, assuming that he was going to demand again that I return the notes that I had taken, or that I assist him in transporting some antique furniture. After an interval of silence, he jammed his finger into the back of my head and repeated, "Hey, big man!" And that was it. A chemical current washed away everything else in my pickled mind. I skipped the escalation of words and jammed my pint glass right into his rigid forehead, scattering him across the bar in a shower of broken glass. He was up on his feet in an instant, and met me halfway through my follow-up with a fist that sent my brain to the back of my skull, and nearly left my teeth floating in midair as my neck snapped back. The room blurred around me, but I remember suddenly being picked up and deposited back onto my stool, dripping in blood from some gash on my head that I could not locate. The large arm of the bartender was patting me on the back, consoling as he roughly shoved the notes back into my hand, and refilled my glass without asking permission. I looked about with my one good eye and saw that Pat was gone. Something brushed past my feet, and I saw the blind dog with its head low, tongue lolling out, licking at the drops of blood on the floor. October 31st. By morning, my eye had swollen shut, and I was alone. Pat's belongings were missing from the bed he had purchased opposite mine, and I wonder where he had slept the previous night. The rain outside was ceaseless, tapping upon the wooden roof lest it be forgotten, and I lay in my bed, nursing my ego about the previous night's events. I concluded that a walk would help clear my mind of whatever these pages and the barman had put in it, and resolved to trek back up to Father Daniel's house, either to return the notes to Pat, who I expected was already there, or at least chase the story to its conclusion. Besides, even in apology, it would be my pleasure to put my boot for that front door, now that it belonged to Pat. Getting back into the house was no difficulty. Father Daniel's door was designed to welcome in visitors, not repel them. The scene was as we had left it the previous day, fossilized and stuck in space like a time capsule. Multi-lettered stalactites shivered down from above me, and dripped paragraphs down onto the inscribed floor. Pat was nowhere to be seen, and I resumed searching the walls for a coherent beginning. A scribbled first page, from which all the interlocking madness from Father Daniel's brain could be compartmentalized. However, panic seemed to be the only theme in his writing, and whatever code he had used to follow these tangled tangents died with him. But from what I could deduce from the gibberish, took on a scientific, almost geological shape. The word minerals showed up again and again, like a cipher. The kitchen had been turned into a canvas of crisscrossing chemical equations, which I could not decipher without an internet connection. From his personal diary entries, Father Daniels apparently began to expect everybody, though of what exactly was never said. only that it tied them all back to that doomed ancestral settlement of heretic monks that had been swallowed by the sea. The village, the ferry, the villagers, with their smiling, unquestioning disregard for the vanished tourists, all of it was a service to a pantomime facade, which drew in and encouraged the people who came here, leaving them at the mercy of their own minds, and slowly pulling away all avenues of escape. My mind ran parallel to Daniel's thinking, the image of the owner of the pub from the previous night. Despite his help, there had always been a sense of the surreal with the man. He was always so eager to please, with that strained look and twist of the mouth, that I not leave just yet and order another drink. He had been eerily upbeat when discussing the missing visitors that filled his empty pub, like he was discussing something as trivial as the weather. He had deflected my probing questions as to why he didn't seem to show any concern about profiting from their demise, replying with a weary smile and a dismissive wave of the hand that reached to offer me another drink. The upstairs of the house was a scene of calm normalcy, juxtaposed against the chaos downstairs. Nothing was disturbed. The bed sheets in the dust-covered bedrooms were neatly creased, and the smiling faces of Daniels and Simon shone out from the picture frames on the bedside table. The only details which stood out as peculiar to the scene were that the door for Simon's bedroom seemed too new for the house, the heavy bolt on it seeming out of all proportion to the quaint civility of the rest of the place. There was also some sort of greasy puddle that soaked into the carpet, in what looked like a wide indentation, like something wet and heavy had oozed there. All of this had done nothing to calm me as I exited the house, and sheltered from the rain under the overhanging porch. Frustrated from my lack of progress with the melted notes, I sat on the wooden porch steps and lit a cigarette. Looking out at the yawning vista, I saw what looked like snow blowing sideways from somewhere out of sight. I traced it with my gaze and saw it was coming from the exterior of the house. I tracked to around the kitchen window. The path between it and the open drop of the cliffs kept me to the wall. There, clumped and pasted against the glass, was the remains of a child's school textbook, smeared in semi-legible hand that formed a single sentence. I read it, and its message had me sprinting back to the waning light of the village. The yawning storm behind me, summoning a piping scream from the cliffs below. November 1st. They are leaving. All of them. All the islanders are departing for the winter without so much as a warning. I saw half-abandoned dinners through the windows as I passed, as families donned their scarves and coats, and trounced down to the ferry as if it was the most natural thing in the world. I pleaded with them at the harbor as they boarded, hounded them, screamed for recognition of what I saw at the house, what they can't or refuse to see. They blinked back at me, with the same vacantly placid gaze, which strained to understand or reassure, with no glint of genuine concern or motivation to listen. They clapped me on the shoulder and tried to coax me onto the ferry, but I shoved them aside and took back off into the hills. They can leave if they want, but I'll see this thing through to the end. I will stare this thing down and know that I am stronger than it. I will not leave here on their terms, or the terms of any other power but my own. God, will this storm ever pass? Later, I lost my way in the storm, and could not navigate the interminable ridges and crevices which pockmarked this place. The cliffs always seemed to be yawning right before me in the dark. It seemed to heave up towards me, clawing itself further inland, snatching the world away, until every step in any direction threatened to send me over. I stumbled blindly in the piercing rain and collided with something solid, something soft. I probed it with shaking hands, and felt it to be the pulped paper markings of the house. I brought down the door as I collapsed into the interior, weeping and delirious from exposure. The script-sewn walls swirled around me, and rearranged itself into perfect sense. I felt a tugging at the end of my trousers, and I knew I needed to descend, to drive myself to the bottom of the cliffs, and see with my waking eyes the manifestations that Daniel had glimpsed, but failed to understand, and what the jumpers had failed to convey in their visions. I poured forth from the house, guided by the glow of this kitchen window, suddenly alight, its lighthouse beacon beckoning me over the edge. I stood at the precipice of that gargantuan pit, and felt the grass whip at my ankles to teeter, and the wind at my back driving me to topple like a fallen tree. I looked below me. In all that cacophonous maelstrom, I saw it. There were lights below, little candles beneath the waves, like luminescent bulbs of deep-sea fish. Beyond them were flat, two-dimensional things, the faces of men and women, with mouths all agape and full of salt and chalk. They darted to and from the mouths of the submerged caves, with sorrowful, curious, childlike, questioning, pleading empty eyes. From their pale mass, a thing quivered out onto the surf, low on its belly. It clicked its way onto the beach, in jittery, larval jerks, on useless upturned limbs, brushing past the shoals of skeletal fish. It arched its head up towards the derelict house, in front of which I stood. A human tongue flopped out of a bovine jaw as it struggled to speak. With a mouth full of chattering teeth and salty froth, it managed a mournful pipe organ sound. And I saw on its back, it wore a child's school bag. The cliff's edge turned away from me, and I felt myself hurled back from the void, crashing into the back of the house and onto the wooden floor. My own diary entry spilling out to mingle with Daniel's. I had regained my sanity and fled. Down the hill, away from that house, through the empty village, with its shuttered windows and bolted doors, the darkness all the while regathering itself and pursuing me. I trampled onto the pier where the absent ferry once stood and dove into one of the discarded rowboats that littered the shore, and drove myself away from the masses that teamed up on the cliff wall and pierced me with their piping eulogy. From my seated position, I faced back towards the village and saw the gathering light emanating from the distant hills, on which the ruins of that very first settlement stood eternally vigilant around that shattered altar in silent prayer for the return of their cursed idol. Visions flashed before my half-blinded eyes of a robed man throwing his arms open to the gathering storm, and a titan that rose from the waves to console him. My arms are torn and bleeding from the strain on the oars, and the mad scramble down the cliff's edge. I am exhausted, and I realize that I am nowhere near as far from the island as I should be. If anything, it seems to get closer. The awful currents that have spewed from those subterranean caves have seized me. I will fill my coat with these pages and stuff them into the bottom of the boat. Maybe they will be found by the returning islanders when they discover my empty boat nestled on the shoreline. The piping has become human speech. They are beckoning. Will this storm never end?